start off just by telling you guys what my project does, what we do, and then a little bit of an update about how the current crisis is affecting what we're doing on the ground and the other charities that we work with. So my name's Jem, I'm the founder and director of the Bright Project. I started getting involved with refugee issues when I was, this is going to be a bit boring for people that have been to any of the talks, any of the pitches that I've done, because it's the same story. But yeah, so I'll tell it briefly. But yeah, I got involved in refugee issues when I was at university. I was at LSE, which is literally just there. And I started mentoring a refugee who was from Darfur, who was 16, he fled here with nothing. Darfur has witnessed the single biggest genocide of the 21st century, hundreds of thousands of people being killed. And when he got here, after everything that he'd been through, one of the big challenges he faced was actually getting anywhere, because he lived out near Heathrow in poor quality housing given by the Home Office, and he was given just £36 a week to live off. And to put that in context, a bus pass now costs about £21 a week. Those days about £17, £18 a week. So that didn't leave much of his daily allowance to spend on. And so actually mentoring him was very difficult because there was nothing we could do. We couldn't actually go anywhere. I had to come to him basically, or fund his, as a student, I had to fund his travel backwards and forwards from Hounslow, which wasn't very cheap for me. So I got an option, which was cycling bonkers, and the first thing I did was get him a bike. And the bike all of a sudden allowed him to access essential resource and service, so education, healthcare, psychological support, base communities, community, things like that. It was really the first step into normal living for him. To cut a long story short, I then ended up setting up in my spare time. We collected bikes, did them up, we gave them away, and I left my job in November 2012 to start the Bike Project, and we launched in March 2013. And since then we've provided just over 1,000 bikes to refugees and asylum seekers in London, and we started providing a little bit further afield to Coventry, Southampton and Oxford. Our core work is we collect second-hand bikes, refurbish them and donate them to refugees, and where refugees find us is they generally refer to us through partner charities, so it's Red Cross, Helen Bamber Foundation, Freedom from Torture, most of the big ones and most of the small ones as well. I don't think there are many refugee charities in London who don't refer people to us. Yeah, all refugees that come to us receive a helmet, set of lights, and a lock. We also run a separate project where we teach refugee women to cycle. In our first year and a half, it was patently clear that most of the people coming to us with bikes were men, and when we dug a little deeper, we realised that the reason for that is because refugee women often come from conservative societies where it wasn't socially acceptable for them to cycle. So we got some funding, and we now teach refugee women to cycle. And that happens on Tuesday at the Jesuit Refugee Centre. Yeah, so that's essentially what we do. I was very lucky to be funded by the Funding Network for the first time in May 2014. And we were very lucky to be funded again by the Strategic Funding Group of the Funding Network in June this year. So we've been very privileged to have support the Funding Network over a couple of years, and that's really helped us scale from, being literally one man and his bike to we now have 6 staff. We provide about 70 to 80 bikes a month and train refugee women with it. And so the Funding Network has really given us cash injections, really key points in our growth. So I'll talk a little bit about the current crisis as well. So in terms of the actual Middle Eastern part of the crisis, that hasn't affected us yet, in the sense that we don't see many Middle Eastern refugees. We still have the sort of general trickle of Iranians and Iraqis and the odd Afghan that we've had for the last few years, but that hasn't really increased with the current crisis. The way it has increased is we're really seeing a huge influx from Eritrea and Albania. In fact, by far the greatest number of asylum applications come from Eritreans at the moment. Eritrea is, according to Human Rights Watch, is below North Korea in terms of totalitarian regimes. So Eritrea is a pretty brutal regime, and that's why a lot of people fleeing, and a lot of them flee around 16, 17 to avoid military conscription. So we have a huge amount of Eritreans coming, and some Ethiopians as well. we have been absolutely inundated with them over the summer. We've also seen a lot of Albanians. That's the other big area that we've seen come to us. Albania, we've dug a little bit deeper trying to figure out what's happening in Albania, and it's really hard to find good sources. From what we understand about the people coming to us, there's some kind of gang warfare in certain parts of Albania that are driving people out and making it very difficult for people to stay. But again, in terms of news, in terms of current affairs, it's very difficult to work out what's happening and why so many people are coming, what's triggered this kind of gang warfare that's going on. So we're seeing a lot of people from those countries. We also, before all of this kicked off, we organised a kind of unofficial cycle to Calais. So we cycled a load of bikes to Calais. We actually organised it before this whole crisis hit the news, but it happened on the August bank holiday weekend, which is when it had already hit the news, and so it was a much bigger thing than we expected. We ended up with 100 people cycling bikes from London to Calais, which ended up being quite a big deal. We did it unofficially just because the insurance implications of actually formally sponsoring it would have probably sort of used up quite a lot of our budget. So we did it unofficially, but it was really interesting ride. It was really interesting. We slept the night in the camp. It was really interesting to see the camp, see what was happening there. People were very warm and welcoming. And to really see what's happening on the ground. In terms of ways of getting involved, we always are short of bikes. We always need more bikes. We're currently setting up a network of people, of donation points around London to facilitate people donating bikes. In terms of, we also have a sponsor a bike emergency appeal where people can sponsor a bike to help us get through this crisis of people, many Eritreans and Albanians coming and the huge demand that's created for bikes. Those are specific ways to get involved in our charity. In terms of on the ground, you hear mixed reports from Calais. When we were there, they really were short of stuff, clothes and stuff with the winter coming up. Since I've been back, lots of people have been saying, they're full, they don't need any more clothes, they don't need any more stuff. So it's really hard to get a good, it's obviously people coming all the time, so it's not just one set of people. So it's really hard to get a good sense of what's actually needed on the ground in Calais. In terms of gear, the really key ways, I think, to get involved are, well, partly financially, but really the big one is, I think, politically. I think that, what we will do around as charities is fantastic, but really the solution has to be a political one ultimately, in terms of resettling people, reforming the asylum process, and having a proper process for accepting people that are fleeing danger.
You've got 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Maybe I'll donate my things to a philanthropic organisation. I'll donate my 2 minutes to you.
Thank you, Jim.
One more thing. I am, if you could all vote for me, that would be great. So you can text.
We've got the link. So
you've got the
link. So you can send it around. You
can text and email. They're encouraging you to do both. I think you've got the link to send around.
Is it stiff competition?
Well, there's 5 of us going for 3 prizes. So the top prize. So if I win, we get 10 grand for the bike project, and the runners up get 6 and 4. So there's quite good prizes. So please vote for me. Cool. Donate 90 seconds.
I've got a number of questions, but I'll follow my instructions and wait till the end. Thank you for that. Next we have Emma from Medical Justice, who I believe was funded in 2011.
That's right.
So quite a while ago. Again, I hadn't heard of you before I joined Tiffin, so I'm really interested to hear what you're about and please take it forward.
Well, I might follow Gem's lead and say my background. Actually, I live in Bedford, and I was minding my own business selling semiconductors, and then they built this place called Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre, and I had a look to see what it was about, and it didn't take long to find out it was really gross construction. So I started campaigning against it, and that meant I eventually got the sack from my job, actually, because they said that my customers saw me more on TV than they did in person, which is a bit kind of true, I suppose. So that it was not long after that we set up Medical Justice. And what we do is we send volunteer doctors into detention centres to see detainees. primarily to document scars of torture, because if we didn't document them, their stories tend not to be believed. And also to challenge instances of medical mistreatment. We see about 1,000 detainees a year, and our growth, especially since 2011, is that we now have 75 doctors going into detention centres in the last year, which is quite a big army of volunteer doctors. We have about 100 volunteer interpreters as well, and we now have 7 members of staff. So it's a small staff team sort of coordinating a big volunteer team. And at our last training day at Garden Court Chambers, just the other side of the square there, we had 34 doctors come last weekend, which is really great. So word of mouth means that we're recruiting more doctors. And it's quite a hard task because these doctors have to go up to places like Yardswood, and it takes a whole day, and you hear all of this really traumatic stuff about detainees, and especially difficult when they've been disbelieved, and especially difficult as a doctor when you are seeing people that are being medically mistreated. And I suppose one of our greatest achievements since 2011 is simply to get a widespread acknowledgement that medical mistreatment does take place in detention, despite all of the denials of the government and the private companies that run the so-called healthcare facilities there. So that's no mean feat, and that's also enabled us to get a lot of medical professional bodies on board, like, for example, the Royal College of Psychiatrists and others who endorse our findings. And what we do is, with seeing 1,000 detainees a year, we also take that individual medical evidence and collate it to come up with research about medical mistreatment, because the Home Office isn't going to believe you when you've got 1 or 2 cases. You really need to compile like 100 cases and put that evidence in front of them about the systemic failings, not just in one detention centre but across all of them. So we combine the casework and the research, and with that research we then do policy work with the Home Office. And because they generally ignore us or don't want to hear us, then often we then take them to court. We undertake strategic litigation to try and force them to change their policies. We also do work in the media, and a good example is this. This is a dossier that we did in about 2010 about children, and that's why we got the funding. We're very grateful from the funding network. And it wasn't long after that then the fate of children being detained was changed radically. And another good example is this one, Expecting Change, about pregnant women in detention. You may have caught this on the news fairly recently, where we've successfully got the Home Office to give an apology to a pregnant woman and issue compensation. And quite sort of groundbreakingly, they have agreed to do a policy review as well. So it looks like we're going to get them to change the policy and hopefully make it so onerous that they don't then detain hardly any pregnant women. That's the aim. And I was also asked to mention that we've got a segregation report launch on Monday if anyone would like to come. I've got some invitations here. We've looked at all of our cases, some of our cases of segregation in the last few years. For example, people being locked up for 22 continuous months in segregation. These are people who've not committed any crime, and in some cases it's driven people really mentally ill. People have become mentally ill in detention, and segregation has been used as a form to control people. So if you'd like to come, that's on Monday in Portcullis House, or opposite House of Commons, and you'd be very welcome to take an invitation. Another invitation is our 10-year party. We're 10 years young this year. Unfortunately, when I first went up to Yardswood, I honestly thought that it was going to be a 6-month project, and we would make them realise that it was all a dreadful mistake and they should turn it into a bingo hall. And unfortunately, I was so naive, I've never been involved with anything like this before. And here we are 10 years later. Anyway, we would like to celebrate the positive aspects of having gotten so many hundreds of detainees out of detention. And that's on Wednesday the 21st in Holloway Road, if anyone would like to come. I think that covers a reasonable amount. The refugee crisis I didn't cover. We have seen a certain increase across the board in detention, but I don't. In general, out of the refugee crisis, so few people are actually reaching the UK, shamefully. But I suppose we do see an increase in numbers across the board. The number of people being detained has increased recently from about 30,000 a year to 32,000 a year. So we are seeing some Syrians. We always see loads of Afghanis, for example, and they're being shipped back in charter flights, which is really alarming. That the Home Office just charter these planes, and then they overfill them in case they can cram more in, and in case some people are taken off through court orders at the last minute. So they take more on the coach to the airport than they're going to be able to stuff on the plane, and then they bring the others back, the leftovers back again, and then try again a few weeks later, which is awful. Everyone knows the situation in Afghanistan.